Do you struggle with hip complaints? And by hip complaints, it can be muscle tears, it can be bursitis or tendonitis, it can be capsular irritation, or it might just be hip pain that you've never had formally diagnosed by a health professional. If you do, and you're an office worker, there's every chance that something that you're doing whilst you're sitting at the desk is the cause of this hip complaint. Now, the hip complaint that you experience, you may not experience it whilst you're sitting at your desk. You might notice it when you try and do a deadlift at the gym. You might notice it when you get out of the car for work each day. You might notice it when you roll over in bed at night. Hip complaints that you experience outside of the office can absolutely be caused by something that you're doing inside of the office. At ERGO Collective, we believe that most people's body complaints come from their poor, static postures. And where do we do most of those? At work, of course. It's really important to think about the ergonomic, the behavioural and the postural things that you do every single work day and how these can contribute to ongoing hip complaints. So let's have a bit more of a chat about the anatomy of the hip, and we'll talk and make some suggestions about some ergonomic, some postural and behavioural things that may be the cause of your hip complaints to start with. Let's talk about the anatomy of the hip and how it's designed to work and where you run into trouble as an office worker in terms of hip complaints. Now, when you sit at a desk for 40 hours a week, what's really important to do is sit with your bum back in the chair, your entire back should be on the backrest, your hip to thigh to pelvis angle should be at about 90 degrees, and your thighs should be like train tracks, both left to right. Now, this is a great, stable, efficient position for the hip to be in. There's very little muscle input that's required to maintain this position, and the hip loves being in this spot. When you're in this spot, all the muscles that are required to be doing working are your internal hip stabilizer muscles, like your obturator and your gemelli. Now, these muscles are awesome. These are your hip endurance muscles. They're very fine muscles. They're only very little. They don't have much muscle bulk. They sit underneath all of your gluteal muscles. And these muscles basically switch on to provide your hip with a bit more stability when it's in a really stable passive position. And this is great. These muscles are your ultramarathon runners of your hip, and they're able to work and support the hip every single day. Where you run into muscular complaints with hip problems, like tendonopathies or muscle tears, is when our hips are no longer put in this position. Say, for example, you cross your right leg over your left leg. When you do that, what you're doing to your hip joint is you're putting a huge amount of internal rotation through that hip joint. Now, this is really problematic for hips because all of a sudden, instead of the loading going nice and square and balanced through your hip joint, you've introduced this torsional rotation to the left. Now, the hip will do it, and it will do it for a period of time, but it's not a great position for the hip to be in because it's quite unstable, and the loading through your ball and socket joint becomes quite problematic. So what the body does is when it determines that that position isn't ideal, you will recruit muscle tone to try and normalize the angle through that hip joint again. The thing is your little hip stabilizer muscles are not strong enough to counter that poor positioning. So what happens is your gluteal muscles and your ITBs and your quadricep muscles will engage. And these muscles are great because they're able to balance that instability within that hip joint, but these guys are your sprinters. They're strong, they're powerful, and they fatigue really quickly, and they're not designed to be used for long periods of time. So when you introduce torsional rotation through your hip, through crossing your leg, you run into trouble with hip complaints because you end up having to recruit those sprint muscles to do an ultramarathon. If you suffer from things like gluteal tendonopathies, if you suffer things from ITP or snapping hip syndrome, these are the sorts of positions that the hip really dislikes. The other hip complaint that causes people hip problems is when you have capsular irritation. So you can imagine that the ball and socket joint has a fair range through it, but when you sit with your hip in that internally rotated position, what you end up doing is you put a lot of load and pressure and torsion through the top inside aspect of the hip. If you have your leg continually in this twisted position, the loading through that joint isn't balanced and even, and it creates a bit of wear and irritation through a small portion of your hip labrum or cartilage. So if you do suffer from things like hip capsular issues, again, I would encourage you to think about the positioning that you put your hip in on a day-to-day basis. What happens is the hips like to be square, and that normalizes the load through that ball and socket joint. If you suffer from adductor tendonopathies, it's a really similar problem to the gluteal tendinopathies. And in this instance, it's generally when you sit with your hip rolled out. This can be a habitual thing, this can be an ergonomic thing, but again, as you externally rotate your hip, your adductors down the inside of your thigh will fire because, again, they're trying to bring that hip back into midline and midpoint. Adductor tendinopathies are a very, very common hip complaint. If you do struggle from hip complaints, I would encourage you to think about where you're putting your hip over the course of the day. So let's have a bit more of a chat about some postural, some ergonomic, and some behavioural things that office workers commonly do that can predispose them to hip complaints. An ergonomic consideration in terms of hip pain is when you're of a shorter height and you sit on an office chair that is too big for you. All office chairs are made to a standard measure, and if you're of a shorter height, often the seat is too big relative to your thighs. As a result, you tend to sit forward on the front edge of the chair because if you sit all the way back, there's too much pressure through the back of your knees and it feels really uncomfortable. When you perch forward on the front edge of the chair, it's a really unstable position to be in. There's a huge amount of pressure and load that goes through your gluteal muscles, your hip flexors, and your quads in this position to maintain this unstable position. If you do suffer from hip problems and you're of a shorter height, I would strongly encourage you to review the depth of your chair. It's really important that there's a nice amount of space between the back of your knees and the start of the chair. And if not, I would encourage you to find a chair which has a smaller seat. Crossing your legs is the single biggest cause of hip problems from a postural perspective. When you cross your leg, you're pulling it across your midline. From a hip joint's perspective, this is easily the most vulnerable and unstable position for it to be in. It puts huge amounts of pressure through the joint capsule itself. So if you suffer from any capsular irritation issues, this is one of the single biggest causes of it. Conversely, sitting in this position will also give you bursitis and tendonitis through that hip. Legs are not designed to be across our bodies for any extended periods of time. It's really important that when you sit that your legs are like train tracks. You want your hips, knees and ankles all to be in the same line. This leg cross is another problem for the hip, and it's the slightly more masculine version of the previous leg cross. Having your hip in this extreme external rotation puts a huge amount of torsional strain through that hip joint. If you have adductor tendinopathies, this hip positioning will cause them every single day of the week. Have a think about the alignment of that hip joint. Have a look at how much pressure is going through the back of the joint and how much strain is going through the front. It's really important that you don't cross your legs either internally or externally when you're sitting at your desk. Hip complaints are often more as a result of behavioural quirks, and one of the big causes of hip complaints is when we sit with our leg dropped off the front of the seat. To achieve this position, you have to be sitting forward of your chair, so you're not sitting with your entire bum back in the chair. And when you're in this position, what you're able to do is you're able to drop the knee down below the height of your hip. This is a really horrible position to put your hip into because your hip is feeling like your leg is about to fall off. If you suffer from iliopsoas tendonopathies or tightness through the front of your hips, I would really encourage you to check where that leg is sitting over the course of the day. The hips and the knees like to be at 90 degrees, but if you're in this position, it puts huge amounts of pressure and strain through the front of that hip joint. To fix this, you just need to sit with your bum all the way back in the chair and that most of your thigh is on the chair seat. If you're in this position, you're not able to drop that knee down. The last behavioural posture is when we pivot around our feet when we're sitting at our desk. This is often what happens when we come in and out of our desk, in that we sit in the chair and we anchor our feet and then we twist around to face the computer monitors and our torso and our hips twist to the screens, but our feet just don't seem to come around with us. When you're in this position, it puts a torsional strain through that hip joint, which can really cause irritations such as tendonitis or bursitis. It's really important that you don't anchor your feet when you're coming in and out of your desk. It's important that your feet come all the way around with you and that the feet, knees, and hips are all in the same alignment. Another behavioural consideration in terms of hip complaints is when we sit with one foot slightly more abducted than the knee and the hip. In this position, what tends to happen is we drop our knee down. And when we drop our knee down, it creates an internal rotation through that hip joint, which is quite an unstable position for it to be in. It's really important that our feet and our knees and our hips are all in the same alignment. If they are, then there's no torsional strain through the lower limb. And this will be a positive thing for the hip because it'll be in a really neutral position. So just make sure that your feet are running parallel with your knees and hips. Another postural consideration, which is a slight variation of the crossed leg positioning we were talking about before, is when we sit like this. This is a crossed leg positioning, but what you can see is that there's a huge amount of stress and strain going through the hip on the lower leg. This is when the top leg basically drags the lower leg across with us, and you end up with this nasty hinging through this knee joint. When you're in this position, there's a huge amount of pressure and strain going through your gluteal muscles, because as that top leg drags that bottom leg into internal rotation, your glutes and your ITBs on that bottom leg are going to fire up, because what they're trying to do is they're trying to normalize the loading through that hip. It's a terrible position to sit in because not only is it terrible for your knee, but it's a shocking place to put your hip into for an extended period of time. As you can see, how you sit at your desk over the course of a work week is really important in maintaining really good musculoskeletal health. Fundamentally, in your body, every joint, ligament, muscle, tendon, bone, it's all got a really specific role, and if you use it how it's designed to be used, generally it'll look after you. What we're hoping is there was something in this video that jumped out at you, whether it was a behavioural quirk, whether it was a poor posture, whether it was an ergonomic issue. What we're hoping is one of those things jumped out at you, and if that aligns to your body complaint, there's every chance by addressing this and fixing this, your body complaint will settle down. If that wasn't the case and you're still a little bit unsure, what I would suggest is to continually just check yourself over the course of the day. What is my head doing? Where is my elbow? What are my feet doing? If you can continually check in with your body over the course of the day, you'll actually realize that you have a lot of consistency in terms of your postures and behaviors. And if you can identify those quirks and change them, generally you'll find that your body is in a much better position. If you would like a little bit of one-on-one attention, what I would suggest is booking for a clinical assessment with one of our staff. That way we can go through all fractions of your life to try and ascertain the cause of your complaint. Sometimes it's a little bit complicated and sometimes it's not easy and straightforward. And this is where a formal clinical assessment with one of our staff is probably the best idea for you. At the end of the day, how you sit at your desk affects your body both inside of the office, but actually more importantly, what it does outside of the office. At ERGO Collective, we're your partners in office health.